Reasonable adjustments. What do we actually mean by this term? When do employers need to make reasonable adjustments? And how on earth do you do it? In this video, I'm going to answer all of those questions for you. So firstly, what are reasonable adjustments and when would you need to make them? Well, the term reasonable adjustments comes from the Equality Act 2010 and it applies in the circumstances where somebody has a disability. And that is a disability as defined by the Equality Act. And that is somebody that has a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. And day-to-day activities are defined as the things that we would normally, most of us would be able to do, or the things that somebody sometimes in that profession would be able to do. So getting ourselves dressed, driving to work, these sorts of things would be day-to-day activities, being able to feed ourselves. These are the sorts of things that we would sort of talk about as day-to-day activities. And that definition is relatively wide. It doesn't require any medical diagnosis. There is no mention in that definition of a medical diagnosis. The impairment doesn't even have to be recognised by the medical community. There is nothing in the definition that mentions any of this. And we're increasingly seeing through tribunal cases just how wide that definition really is. So that's the definition of a disability. If somebody falls under that definition of having a disability, there is a duty on the employer to provide reasonable adjustments that help the individual to be able to manage the things they need to in the work environment. Those adjustments are going to be the things that the individual needs, and whether or not they're reasonable is going to come down to the individual circumstances. It's going to be a case-by-case basis, so we can't list every reasonable adjustment that you could possibly make. But the requirement to make reasonable adjustments does fall on employers if they know there's a disability or they reasonably ought to have known that there is a disability. And that requirement is not just to do the things that are fairly obvious. So putting ramps on a building, for example, or installing a lift are generally expected now that when we get to a building, that's what we're going to find. Often the reasonable adjustments that employers are looking at are much wider than this and much more about that particular individual. So what do we need to consider and how do we make those reasonable adjustments? Well, it starts by talking to the individual, understanding the impairment, understanding the impact that it has on them, and therefore being able to talk through the possibilities for being able to overcome that and the things that can be put in place to help. We can't always overcome it, but the things that can be put in place to help the individual. The conversation with the individual should focus on explaining the impairment and what can be done to overcome it. So just as an example for myself, if anybody's seen me in person, you'll know that I'm very short. That's not a disability, just to clarify here, but I'm using it as an example. So that conversation about me being short is about me not being able to reach things. So I might be, can't reach that, somebody else will have to do it. Or I can be, I can't reach that, but if you provide me with a step stool, then I'll be able to. And that's what we're looking for in that conversation. We're looking for what is needed to be able to accommodate and to be able to overcome the challenges that people face. We can't always overcome them. And sometimes that will be that we need somebody else there to support it. But very often it'll be about things like technology, tools, resources, things that we can put in place to help overcome. For some people, they'll be very familiar with their disability. They will understand it intrinsically and they will be able to tell you exactly what it is that they need to be able to overcome, to help them, to support them. Like, I need a step stool. That's a simple explanation, not very expensive to put in place, and most employers can resolve that fairly quickly and easily. For other disabilities, and we're particularly seeing this in people with neurodivergent conditions, they haven't had the opportunity to be brought up knowing and understanding their disability, their impairment, the impact it has on them and how to overcome it. For many of these people, this is something that they're newly realising. They may well have been masking, they may well have been trying to hide the fact this is a challenge. They may well have found that they've lost jobs in the past over it and not really understood why. All these things come together to make a situation where it's really hard for the individual to say, this is the impairment. and this is the support I need to overcome it. And in those situations, we may use support like occupational health therapists to be able to assist us in understanding where we can help the individual. So send in somebody to see a specialist who can produce a report for us. Just make sure that that specialist is a specialist in occupational health, in that they understand the impacts of someone's condition on the work environment, but also that they're familiar with and understand that individual's condition as well, because if the individual's not fully understanding it, they're going to need an expert that can help them to find those tools. It may also mean that there's some trial and error. There's some, oh, let's try this, let's put this in place, and then we may need to do some more from that as well. But again, these things should be relatively straightforward. They should be about finding tools that can be put in place on a day-to-day basis that are not hugely costly. We're not talking about transforming buildings as we have done with things like putting ramps and lifts into buildings. A lot of these are a lot smaller than those things, and therefore we don't see them as obviously as to what they're needed and how that they can help. And when it comes to making those adjustments, firstly, drop the word reasonable. Look first at what adjustments does this individual need to be able to perform at the level we need them to be performing at. Consider what that really means in terms of the level we need them to be performing at. As an example, there's been a recent case where somebody with dyslexia was able to successfully claim that due to the time blindness, which is a symptom of their dyslexia, they weren't able to be at work on time every day. And the tribunal said, yes, it would be a reasonable adjustment to allow somebody the grace to be late to work. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to pay them to be late for work. There can still be adjustments and things to their pay to reflect the work they're actually doing, or maybe they stay at work later to make up for the hours. But really think about, what are our expectations, and are those expectations right? Are they needed? Are there adjustments we can make to those expectations, as well as adjustments we can make to supporting somebody to meet those expectations? So consider everything. Consider all of the adjustments that could possibly be made to support this individual. Then the next question we ask is, are the adjustments reasonable? Is it something that we can put in place? Cost implications are unlikely to be a good defence for something not being reasonable. It is expected that employers will have costs involved in making reasonable adjustments. It is a case of looking at, what is it that we genuinely need? So in the case of lateness, for example, it may be a reasonable adjustment to allow somebody to be late to work. However, if their role is critical in that for the safety of others, them turning up late, perhaps they're the only person in this role, in a safety critical role, and if they turn up late, it puts the safety of others at risk, it may not be a reasonable adjustment to allow them to be late for work. That might not be something that could be accommodated. What we might then look at is it a reasonable adjustment to put them into another role elsewhere that would allow for them being late to work and would have less impact? So we need to think quite widely around the reasonable adjustments and what is reasonable and what we can accommodate. And what is reasonable is going to depend on the circumstances of the business as well as the individuals. So the judgment of what's reasonable on a larger organisation may well be different to what's reasonable on a smaller organisation. And then once we've established what are reasonable adjustments, we need to put those in place. We need to make sure that they are acted on. We need to make sure there's reviews in place so that we can consider, have we gone far enough? Were these the right adjustments? Are there different adjustments that need making? If we can't make the reasonable adjustments that are needed to enable somebody to work, then it may be that we either have to withdraw an offer of employment or dismiss on the basis that they're not capable of doing the role and there are no reasonable adjustments that can be made to enable them to be capable. There are some circumstances where that happens. It's not that often, but there are circumstances where that happens, and that could be a fair dismissal. Just a note on the recruitment process, it's really important to ask people whether there's any adjustments that they need to the recruitment process because of their disability. Aside from that though, we shouldn't be asking any health questions before we offer somebody the role. We can ask health questions that are relevant after we've offered the role, and if then it comes to light that somebody has a disability, we would then look at what adjustments do they need, are they reasonable, can we make them, and if not, we may have to withdraw that offer on the basis of their disability. But that should be done after we've offered the role, not asking those questions up front before we invite somebody to interview, aside from are there any adjustments we can make to the interview process or the recruitment process to enable you to fully participate in that process. So just to recap then, the first question is, do they have a disability as defined by the Equality Act? Then what adjustments do they need in order to be able to perform the role? Then are those adjustments reasonable? Can we make those adjustments? Then we need to make the adjustments, or if they are not reasonable, if we can't make the adjustments that enable them to perform, we may need to dismiss or to withdraw an offer of employment. And we should be regularly reviewing those adjustments to make sure that they are the right adjustments, whether any new adjustments need to be made. We should be reviewing that. We should be making sure that we're considering whether the individual has what they need to be able to perform in the role. And I do recommend that you take advice throughout this process. In particular, if you're going to say that adjustments are not reasonable, do take advice on that, because you could find yourselves with an unfair dismissal claim. If somebody is dismissed because of a disability, that's an automatic unfair dismissal, and they are able to bring that claim with less than 2 years of service. And if they're not offered a role, they can still make an employment tribunal claim on that basis because of their disability as well. So do take advice around that, particularly if you're not able to make the reasonable adjustments, or if you're trying to work out what reasonable adjustments need to be made, take advice there too. There is a link in the description below for how you can get in touch with us to get advice on reasonable adjustments, how you support an employee, or if you can't make those adjustments, advice on a dismissal. We can support you with all of that. And of course, if you want to keep up to date on all things employment law, HR, management, do subscribe and hit that notification bell, and I will be doing some more videos around reasonable adjustments and the type of adjustments you can make, particularly for neurodivergent conditions.